ladies and gentlemen, and in the final installment of World War II Shooter Month, we are going back to the past to play a game that kicks ass. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're taking a look at Medal of Honor 1 on the PlayStation 1. For the longest time, I had always thought that Medal of Honor Allied Assault from 2002 was the first game in the Medal of Honor series. But it would seem that I was wrong. The excellent Medal of Honor World War II shooters instead got their start on the console equivalent to the T-34, the PlayStation. This game was developed by DreamWorks Interactive, and its story was written by none other than Steven Spielberg. This was still the 90s, when major directors actually made non-movie productions. The game was a first-person shooter of the highest quality, at least for a console in 1999. The shooting is okay, but it has aged tremendously. Since this was from a time before two-thumbstick aiming, you instead have a system where you use the right trigger to bring up a crosshair, and then you use the left thumbstick to control said crosshair. This is the only means of precise aiming in the game, and is every bit as clunky as it sounds. Thankfully, the game for the most part understands that you have to jump through hoops to actually aim, and does not throw too many enemies at you at any one time. At least at first. This, like Medal of Honor Airborne, actually has an ascending difficulty curve. When you first start the game, you face a couple of troopers, and you can dispatch them with relative ease. But as you work your way through the game, you face harder and harder enemies until you start to face gas-masked enemies that can tank numerous rifle shots. I guess the gas mask just pumps meth straight to their brain, so that when they get hit by a 30-06 round, it feels like a 22 to them. The enemy AI is fairly decent to a degree, but sometimes they will stand around gormlessly while you mow them down. When their brains are not simple Folgers crystals, they can be deadly, and they can blind fire, and damn, these must be some strong Germans. Or perhaps they're Austrians. For puny Germans cannot possibly shoot a K98K one-handed. This actually makes the average Austrian troop a bit dangerous, as they can hit you fairly easily, while shooting them is more difficult since they are in cover and only a small bit of them is sticking out. Some troops later in the game will also start to chuck grenades, but hilariously they will actually be a bigger danger to themselves, as most of the time they don't throw them far enough and end up blowing themselves up. And then in one mission you have to destroy a Ju-87. I hid behind it for cover, and the enemy troops destroyed it for me. I love it when the enemy helps out through sheer incompetence. Still, despite the somewhat wonky AI, the enemies still provide a good degree of challenge. And if you can get over that control scheme, you will find yourself getting drawn into the game. The graphics have of course aged, and they've aged a lot. Remember, this is a PlayStation 1 first-person shooter, so they didn't have a lot of hardware to work with. Still, the game actually looks fairly recognizable as to what it's supposed to be. The gun models still resemble the guns they're supposed to be representing, even if they are very low res. The enemies look very polygonal, but they are still fairly decent, and they actually are fairly well detailed here and there, and the enemy troops actually have differing uniforms. The level design is still pretty bloody excellent, on par with a PC game in many respects. Since this is a PS1 game, the developers had to cheat a little. They simply have shrunk a number of things so that the levels could have PC levels of details. For example, here is a Tiger 1 tank. It's recognizable as a Tiger 1 tank, but it's a fraction of a Tiger 1 tank's actual size. According to one source I read, it's actually the size of a Panzer 1 in this game. Still, I'm glad to have it here, even if it's small. And it's pretty bloody slick how they simply shrunk down a few things to make them fit. One of the coolest levels is where you take down a railway cannon. It's a really fun mission that shows that style mitigates the low-res graphics. Style and substance can overcome mere graphics. Many modern games have super amazing graphics, but they lack the style to make the most of them. Here, we have to take down a railway cannon, but you have to fight your way there. The battle there is fun because you're fighting through some canyons and not just through bland corridors. But the entire time you're fighting to the cannon, you see it shooting off in the distance. Sure, it's just some flashing lights, but since you know it's a cannon going off, your imagination fills in the graphical gaps. And that's what a lot of these older games did. They relied on you, the player, getting invested and actually using the old Bat computer, aka your brain, And when you get to the railway gun, it's a railway gun, and it looks cool, although it's just a fraction of the size it would normally be. But the fact is, it's still there, and it's still awesome. As you've no doubt seen, there is a great deal of distance fog. This was to be expected from a shooter of this era, and is kind of funny at times, as it makes it seem like Pedersen, the player character, is just really, really nearsighted. Even my eyesight is better than that. My bloody glasses are 6 inches thick. And here we have the main menu from Medal of Honor. You know you've got a legend when even the menu system is extraordinarily elaborate. You've got characters walking around answering phones and things of that nature. Hell, this is even more elaborate than Medal of Honor Allied Assault's menu system, which kind of looked like this but didn't have people wandering around. Ultimately, you know the developers cared when they even spent time on the bloody menus. The overall frame rate for Medal of Honor is decent enough, and it will usually stick at 30 FPS, but in some of the more busier areas it will indeed dip down. Moving right along, the objectives for the game are varied and quite enjoyable to complete. And since this is a PlayStation 1 game, you invariably have to go in search of a certain object to open another object. These objectives ensure that you have context for what you are doing and add another layer of challenge to the game. Hell, you can find the exit to a level and the game will just let you walk out without completing all the objectives, and it fails you the instant you walk out. There is definitely no hand-holding in this game whatsoever, and that of course extends to the health system. You do not have regenerative health, rather it's the classic health pack system. The game, at least on reasonable difficulties, gives you enough health so that you do not die every 6 feet. And like in later Medal of Honor games, you can shoot healing canteens out of enemies. Although I love how they are called medicinal canteens in this game. Dude, it's not illegal. It's medicinal, man. 'Cause I've got a fever, and the only cure is more cowbell and special water. Since this is a game from the space year 1999, the game has a little bit of jumping in it. Not platforming, just jumping over obstacles. When in modern gaming mode, this might lead some players such as myself to wander around trying to figure out where to go when all you needed to do was jump over a tiny obstacle. Now, despite the fact that this is a PlayStation 1 game, the levels are actually pretty bloody big. They are, of course, somewhat linear, but they are not just straight hallways or anything of that nature. Rather, for the most part, there are large levels that you can explore, and you can actually miss things in the level as well, and you actually have to look for the various objectives because the game does not give you objective markers. Many of the levels will of course be indoors due to hardware constraints, but the game actually gives context as to why you're going to be fighting indoors in general. And they're actually fairly fun indoor levels despite them being a more linear environment than the larger outdoor levels. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't have at least a few weapon reviews. In a manner similar to the later Medal of Honor Allied Assault, you are given weapons at the start of each mission, and very seldom will you be able to pick up any new weapons, but unlike in later games, you can use ammo from any dropped weapon. You start the game with the Caliber 30 M1, and like in real life, it is the finest battle implement ever devised, and is pretty much the best weapon in the game in terms of range, knockdown power, and ammo availability, because for some reason, it uses both 30-06 and 8mm Mauser. You then have the MP40, and it is the best SMG in the game, as it is accurate and powerful. Then you have the pistols. The Walther P38 is accurate and powerful, more so for some reason than the 1911, which actually feels weaker than the P38 despite the 1911 being chambered in 45 ACP. Lastly, you have the silenced pistol. Unlike in Medal of Honor Allied Assault, it's actually semi-automatic and works well in the stealth missions. The Thompson submachine gun shows up and is less accurate and powerful than the MP40 for some reason. The American weapons seem to be a bit underpowered compared to some of the German weapons. However, one weapon that isn't underpowered is, of course, the Browning automatic rifle, and it just stomps most of the competition. Another weapon that is thankfully exempt from German bias is the Winnie Shotty, aka the Winchester shotgun. This shotgun has actually been seen in a great many Medal of Honor games, and is absolutely excellent for dealing with enemies in close quarters. And since this game is a little more enclosed than the later Medal of Honors, you'll find yourself using this more in this game than just about any of the other Medal of Honor titles. And lastly, we of course have the 1903 Springfield sniper rifle. Or do we? This doesn't look much like a 1903 Springfield sniper rifle. Rather, this kinda looks like some unholy abomination of Springfield and Mosin-Nagant, seeing as how this has a straight bolt instead of a turned down bolt. Hell, in real life you couldn't even turn the bolt because the scope would be in the way. But, oh well, this is indeed a game from 1999, and likely the PSX just didn't have quite the graphical abilities to render a turned down bolt. As you'd expect, this is the game's sniper rifle, and it works quite well in that role. So now, let's take a look at the Spielbergian story. The story is, of course, entirely historical fiction, bordering on Wolfenstein levels of historical fiction at times. You play as Jimmy Patterson, and you work for the OSS, performing various missions of daring do in occupied Europe. When each mission begins, you get a briefing from your CO, and then additional information from a member of the French Resistance. Each mission relies upon cool rather than reality. For example, in one mission you have to sneak onto a super U-boat and sink it. And that U-boat is, of course, way more powerful than anything the real Kriegsmarine had at the time. And then there is a mission where you have to infiltrate a massive bunker complex to stop a fiendish plot to produce super mustard gas. And the mission also makes the Ju-87 out to be a super powerful dive bomber as well, even though by this point in the war it was hopelessly obsolete. Also, super mustard gas? Really? Wouldn't any of the real nerve agents created during the war be way more deadly? But we must keep in mind that we are here to have fun, and sometimes reality can get in the way of a good story and a good time. Medal of Honor is one of those games where you know the developers put their blood, sweat, and tears into a game that they wanted to be the very best possible. And really, they have succeeded beyond likely even their wildest imaginings, as even in 2017, this is still one of the best World War II shooters of all time. Sure, the graphics are old and the gameplay is a little clunky, but the overall experience is still pretty bloody fun. And I would go as far to say that the overall Medal of Honor experience is more than the sum of its parts. Ultimately, is the game either a curio and relic, or is it a game worth playing? Well, like with the Mosin-Nagant, it's both. The Mosin-Nagant works quite well as a hunting and target rifle, but of course it still is a fairly antiquated design. But it still gets the job done. Medal of Honor is a game that is a bit antiquated in its design and graphics, but it still gets the job done when it comes to fun, and I highly recommend checking it out. And so, I am GeneralLotz, wishing you good Medal of Honor, Frontline, and good Medal of Honor Heroes, or whatever makes you happy. If you enjoyed my review of Medal of Honor PSX, please consider subscribing, and if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon so that I can continue bringing you these awesome video game reviews.